either going to love it or you're going to hate it. I'm Al, this is the Geek in Review, so let's get to it. Now, after the shocking ending of last week with the betrayal and death of Harry Seldon, I was interested to see in where this episode would pick up. And as I mentioned in my last video, and if you've not checked it out and you've not watched the first few episodes of this, I'd recommend you go back and do it because you're not going to understand any of this. But as I mentioned in that video, books can jump decades between chapters in them themselves, and I did wonder how they were going to incorporate the use of time jumps to tell the story. Now this episode opens 400 years earlier with Cleon, the original Emperor, and this is the guy that we did see in the box in the first two episodes, and he does look older than Brother Dusk, so he is older than we have seen him at any point in his life, or their lives. That's quite a hard way to put in, or it's quite a difficult idea to put into the right tense. And we see that Demerzel was with Cleon all the way back then at the formation of what was going to become the genetic dynasty. Now, one thing that he does reveal is that the genetic dynasty doesn't seem to have been the original plan that he had for the continuation of the Empire. There is mention of a successor, which is kind of a big deal because we know that the dynasty did exist. So what happened that changed the original plan? Well, it did seem that Cleon was a little bit obsessed with his legacy. We do see that the Star Bridge is getting constructed during this time and he wanted to live long enough and consider it to be like his life's work. And it is good to get a little bit of backstory on how these guys came about to be and what led to the formation of the Empire, because as Harry said in the first two episodes, the fact that there's not been any real change at the heart of the Empire is a factor that's going to lead to its downfall. Now, some of the episodes are set 19 years after the disaster at the Star Bridge bombing, and this is the first real time in the show that they're using time jumps that are present in the books. Now, I'm not going to get into the differences between the books and the TV show. The pace is totally different and it will affect the story, but I did wonder, as I said before, how effective these time jumps were going to be in a storytelling narrative on screen. And it works really well, I have to say. You do have to pay attention to the text that's on screen. And if I am being honest, Apple TV, if you're watching, if you could leave the text on screen for 2 more seconds, that would be a lot more helpful for me. I don't know about anyone else, but I did find that it did jump quite quickly, and if you're not watching it, it's a blink and you'll miss it thing. Because it's 19 years after the Star Bridge destruction, Brother Dusk is now round about the same age that the original Emperor Cleon was when he died. And Cleon is actually in the same scene, he's just in the plastic box Han Solo style again. And he's discussing again with Demerzel about what's going to happen with the Star Bridge that's falling onto the planet after all these years onto Trantor, because this is going to be quite a big problem, and even after almost 2 decades, they're still trying to rebuild from this attack on their planet. Demerzel does briefly go into a bit of history about what happened to the original Cleon, that when he died he had to entrust the Empire to an infant version of himself. Now this will come back later on in the episode, so I'll get back into that. I do hope that they fill in the blanks and use Demerzel to see what this first clone, or what happened with this first clone and how they were raised, because they were the ones that were then going to have to, or be the first version that's seen Brother Day, Brother Dusk, that sort of thing. So I'll be very interested to see how the original dynamic worked, and if it has always worked, or if there ever has been any sort of inconsistencies or breaks in it. Because this episode hints quite heavily that that potentially could happen, and if this has been on for centuries, there's a chance that it sort of may have happened before. But again, as I mentioned in my last videos, having these 3 characters span the time in the books and the story is a great anchor for the viewer, and it's working really well. Now, because 19 years have passed, the clones have gotten older, so Dawn is now the age that Day was in the episode 1, whereas Day is now Dusk's age and Dusk is now Cleon's age. Because of time and clones. Just think about it. You really do need to pay attention to this show, and I love this. There's not a lot of shows that demand this much attention. I think the last one was the... Now, what I really enjoyed about this episode is we get to see how these guys interact at different points in their life, and this is going to be key to how this story is told. As it said, it's been 20 years since the destruction of the Star Bridge, and they are discussing events which for them have already happened. But maybe these events we might see happen later on in the show, or they might mention other things that we're going to see in a sort of flashback. That would be great, but I can see why they might want to restrict the sort of flow of the time jumps or the way that they're using time to tell the story, because it is going to be quite hard to follow if they do rely on it too often, or they do sort of throw things in for shock value or plot twists. I'll be honest, I don't really see that happening, but I'm certainly looking forward to how these characters are going to interact over the future, and how we're going to see them interact in the past as well with each other. But one thing to take away from this episode and the genetic dynasty is to keep in mind that just because they believe something or they see something from a certain point of view doesn't mean that that's the way that it's going to play. Like Cleon the original, they seem to be worried about the legacy of Well themselves. Dusk wants to save the remains of the Sky Bridge. Day reminds them that that it's Cleon's legacy, not his legacy. And this really is an episode about the Empire. Well, it's an episode of two halves, but it's just about how the Empire is getting ruled and what these guys have been up to. But on a deeper level, it's also raising a lot more questions about destiny, nature versus nurture, and all that deep stuff that we'll try to explain about how fucked up we are as human beings. These guys are sort of outside that because they're raising each other, and they're not only learning from their own mistakes, they're learning from their own wisdom and knowledge. So again, it's one of those cases, if you could go back and tell your 15 or 18-year-old self to do things, would they do it? Would they take on that knowledge? How receptive to that would they be? But one thing that did stand out to me about this whole system that they have with the genetic dynasty is, if you're one of the younger clones, you know where the road ends, and every version of you keeps going down the same road. So at some point in your life you must question, do you keep doing the same thing, or will you be the one that tries to take a different path? This is essentially what Harry said when he was speaking to Brother Day at the end of episode 1, and why the Foundation was set up. But as I said, it's an episode of two halves, and we do landing on Terminus, and we find out a little bit more about Harry's equations as well, and he had predicted this and what they were going to need, or at least some of the stuff that they were going to need to set up a colony there and survive and thrive. But as soon as they arrive, they discover the vault, and they approach it and get pushed back, and they all fall over, and it sort of makes them a bit woozy and sick, a sort of nausea type thing. Apart from Salvor, but this won't be for years later for them, but we've already seen it in the first two episodes. So again, time, stories, whatever, you've just got to keep track. Now, as the original colonists can access the vault, it sort of becomes a bit of an urban myth in their society within the colony. And we also find out as well that they're not alone. There are some animals on the planet that do look quite threatening, but they do seem to have them under control. And we get to see quite a few decades of life in the colony in the second half of this episode. It seems to be well settled, and the Foundation are working away, and we do see them discussing things about what they're going to have to keep. With specifics, it was something to do with timekeeping. So if you're measuring time, do you use sundials, hourglasses, various other methods? And while this doesn't seem particularly important to the larger plot as a whole, when you think about it, the day-to-day decisions that these guys are going to make, no matter how small, are going to have huge galactic impacts for millions, if not billions or trillions of people. So they do really need to get the minutiae right and make sure that one thing leads to another in order for the Foundation and Harry's plan to work. Now, I'm not going to get into too much spoilers in this episode. It does seem that there is going to be a potential pending threat to the colony, but I guess we're going to have to wait and see. Until the next episode. Now, I have to say, I did really enjoy this episode. I thought it was a welcome change of pace after episode 2. I did think that was a little bit flat, which is why I didn't go into too much detail on my video on that episode. The show does seem to be really settling into itself, and I'm liking how the story works, how the concept of time works within the stories, and the fact that this is only 10 episodes. I think this is going to be a very tightly packed show. Now, a lot of people weren't particularly grabbed by the first two episodes, and I can understand why. The pacing was a little bit slow, but I think it will change going forward with the remaining 7 episodes. But as always, this is just my opinion. Are you guys enjoying Foundation? Let me know what you think in the comments below, or you can follow me on Twitter and reach me there at The Geeks Reviews. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching the video, and do leave a like and subscribe to the channel, it would mean a lot.